Today, I want to share with you one of my favourite techniques that I use to capture around 80 to 90% of my images. I'm talking exposure bracketing. Let's go. Hi there, how you doing? Welcome back to the channel. I'm at Cliff Pools Nature Reserve this morning. We're talking exposure bracketing, one of my favourite techniques in photography. I've got one composition in mind that we're going to go off and shoot, and then we'll go back to Lightroom so you can see that full end-to-end process. I'm not gonna lie, I'm really excited to be back at this location. It's been about 2 years since I've been here. The composition I'm gonna try and capture today was one of the first that got me really hooked into this amazing hobby. So this is our main subject today. It's a bit of a nothing pier, yet this is the location where I discovered my love of long exposures. I've got to come here for high tide though, and timings just haven't worked for me of late, which is why, or one reason why it's been so long since I've been along here. This spot as well was the location where I produced my first ever video. I can't remember where I uploaded it to, but it was the main precursor to setting up the YouTube channel, although it took about a year for me to have the guts to start producing the videos that you've been seeing since the turn of the year. In terms of the composition, the irritation is the fact there's no separation between the pier and the land in the distance, but I've just got to work with what I've got. The last time I came here, it was for sunset. On the other hand, golden hour's just finished. So the conditions are very much different. But what I'll do is I'll put that original image up on screen for you now. So camera is set up, let's get talking about the main topic of today's video, which is exposure bracketing. It's a technique that I use for around 80 to 90% of my images, as I said at the start of the video. Reason being, it gives me the most control over my edits back in Lightroom, and as you'll see at the end of this video. Now, there's two ways that you can exposure bracket. The first is you can get the camera to do it all for you, which means you go into the menu and you're looking for exposure comp/AEB. That's the setting on a Canon. Might be different for Nikon and Sony, but here you're just setting up the camera so it takes 3 images, one perfectly exposed, one underexposed, one overexposed. Once that's set up, come back to the live view, and of course we can then just make sure that first image is going to be set perfectly exposed. 2-second timer, and then we get our 3 images taken for us by the camera. Nice and simple. Now for me, I personally prefer to do everything manually. Why? Because it just gives me that little bit more control. Reason being is, instead of just using the exposure key at the bottom, I prefer to operate first of all for that overexposed shot, so I get the most out of the shadows, most out of the foreground. I prefer to use the histogram. What I'm looking to do is I like to expose to the right as best as possible, ETTR. So there's a nice little spike over by the shadows, and in that case, it's 1 stop over exposed, which means I'm at 1/13 of a second for this first shot. Shutter activated, first shot captured. We're now going to go back 1 stop of light, so we're now perfectly exposed. Histogram looks great, it's nicely spread out. Here's our second shot taken, and now we're going to want to think about overexposing our shots, getting the most out of the highlights, getting the most out of the background. I tend to take 2 overexposed shots just as a precaution, just so I get as much out of the cloud, out of the sky as possible. We don't have too much going on at the moment, just enough though. So we go 1 stop overexposed. That gives me a shutter now of 1/50th of a second. And now we'll go to 2 stops of light overexposed. Takes me to 1/100th of a second. Shutter activated. There's our final image taken. We'll now go back to Lightroom, get these images merged together and complete the process. So as you can see, I'm back home now. I've had an afternoon of watching the football, of watching Formula One. It's night time now. I have also been reviewing and editing the images that I took this morning, that composition I walked you through. Those weren't the only images that I took today. I think I took something like 211 in total. Of those, I've kept 55, but there was a lot of exposure bracketing, there was a lot of image merging, a lot of work in Lightroom, which I'm going to walk you through now. So let's get editing. You can see here we've got our 4 shots, all taken at different exposure levels. Up in the corner, we've got the histogram, and if I filter through the shots, you'll see it moving across the graph from right over towards the left, just like I described this morning. If we go back to the first shot and the overexposed image, like I mentioned, it's all about exposing to the right to begin with, getting a nice neat spike, meaning we've got as much data in the shadows as possible, just as you can see up here. If I then jump straight across to the last image, the exaggerated, the heavily underexposed shot. Here we've got the data in the highlights. You can see the difference in the sky between the overexposed shot and the underexposed image, with the histogram 2 showing the spike over towards the left of the graph a lot more on this occasion. It's ideal for me on a personal note because it gives me so much to play with. I don't always exposure bracket. Sometimes I'm really not bothered about being able to edit both the highlights and the shadows, in which case I will tend to just compromise on one or the other, but that is really very rare. Now, before we think about editing, we need to merge these 4 images into one. So to do that, I'll highlight all 4 images, holding down the Shift key on the PC. I'm not sure what it might be on a Mac, and then clicking on all the first and the last, so all are highlighted as need be, and then just clicking anywhere down here on one of the images, we'll right click, and then from the list that appears we'll want photo merge and we'll want HDR. Lightroom's then going to create this HDR preview for me. I always leave auto settings unchecked. It's just best just to leave it so I can make my own adjustments, which I'll do in a minute. And then we'll finish by clicking merge. This part of the process doesn't take too long. It shouldn't take too long, but of course, if you've got a decent computer, it'll be a little bit quicker than, of course, if you've got a slightly older one. I'm going to hit cancel in this case though, just to save on a little bit of time, because I did that photo merge a little bit earlier on, and this is the image that we're left with. Of course, just to put a little bit more emphasis on it, if I push the highlights all the way over to the left, you see how much detail we get in that sky. Again, If I pull the shadows all the way over to the right, again, look how much detail we get to play with. Look what we can do now with our edit. This is why I do what I do in terms of setting up the exposure bracket out on location. Of course, if I come back to that first image, that overexposed image, just for example, if I pull the highlights all the way to the left, we've barely got anything to play with in the sky, in the highlights. Again, if we go to that really underexposed image, of course, in this case, we get so much data to play with the highlights. Of course, if we pull the shadows all the way to the right now, we've got barely nothing. That is the beauty of exposure bracketing. That's why I do it so much. That's why it's my go-to technique for so many of my images. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to put this final edit together, and I'll share this final image up on screen in just a moment.